Every March, something happens that nobody questions. Hundreds of millions of people put on green clothes, walk into a pub, and raise a glass to a man they know almost nothing about. A river in Chicago is dyed green. The pyramids of Giza are lit green. The Sydney Opera House goes green. The Colosseum, the London Eye, Niagara Falls, all green. An entire planet changes colour for a single day in honour of a man whose name most people couldn't spell, whose story most people have never heard, and whose actual life looks nothing like the holiday that carries his name. You know the name, St. Patrick. You know the date, March the 17th. You know the colour, the shamrock, the pint, the parade. But do you know the man? Because when I went looking for the man behind the green beer, I found something I wasn't expecting, and it's going to change the way you see every St. Patrick's Day for the rest of your life. But before we continue, the Midnight Archives exist for one reason, and that's to find the stories they buried, the ones too dark to be told during the day. They buried this one for a reason, and now we're going to dig it up. If that's what you're here for, hit subscribe and like this video, and I'll keep the candle lit. Now, let's find out who St. Patrick really was. Welcome to the Midnight Archives. Chapter 1. The Slave on the Hillside. The patron saint of Ireland wasn't Irish. He was British, born in Roman Britain, spoke Latin, had never heard of Ireland until the night a raiding party broke into his family's estate and took everything from him. He was 16 years old, and his real name wasn't Patrick. His name was Maewyn Succat. He was born around the year 385 AD in a place the Romans called Banavem Tabernae. Nobody knows exactly where that is. Scholars have argued over its location for centuries, somewhere in Western Britain, most likely Wales, or the southwest of England, or possibly even lowland Scotland. The precise coordinates don't matter. What matters is the world he was born into. Britain in the late 4th century was still Roman. The legions hadn't left yet. That would come in 410, when the empire pulled its troops back to defend Rome itself, and the island was left to fend for itself against the Saxons and the Picts and the raiders from across the Irish Sea. But in 385, the system still held. There were roads, there were villas, there were towns with markets and bathhouses and churches. Maewyn's family was part of the Romanized British Christian gentry. Not wealthy by Roman standards, but comfortable. His father, Calpurnius, was a deacon in the local church and a minor civic official. His grandfather, Titus, had been a priest. This was not a family of zealots. Maewyn himself would later admit that as a teenager, he didn't take his faith seriously. He went through the motions. He attended the services. He was, by his own account, an ordinary boy in an ordinary household, living an ordinary life in a world that seemed, on the surface, stable and permanent and safe. It was not. The western coast of Britain was a hunting ground. Irish raiding parties, warriors from the kingdoms across the sea, made regular incursions along the coast, taking cattle, goods and people, slaves. The slave trade was central to the economy of early medieval Ireland. Irish chieftains needed labour for their farms and households, and the cheapest way to get it was to take it. The raids were seasonal, predictable, and devastating for the communities they hit. Maewyn was 16 when the raiders came. We know this because he told us. The man who had become St. Patrick left behind 2 documents. Only 2, and both in his own hand. The first is the Confessio, a spiritual autobiography written near the end of his life. The second is the Epistola, a letter of furious condemnation directed at a British warlord who had enslaved some of Patrick's converts. Together, they are the only surviving first-person account of life in 5th century Britain and Ireland. They are also 2 of the most raw, most psychologically exposed documents in early medieval literature. In the Confessio, Patrick describes the night of the raid. He doesn't give details of the violence. He doesn't describe the fighting, or the screaming, or the burning. He simply says he was taken captive. The restraint of that phrase set against what must have been the most terrifying night of his life, tells you something about the man. He doesn't perform his suffering, he states it and moves on. He was put on a ship, he was taken across the Irish Sea, and he was sold. His master was a chieftain. Tradition identifies him as a man named Milchu, who ruled territory in what is now either County Antrim in the northeast or County Mayo in the west. The sources disagree, and Patrick himself never names the location. What he does describe is the work. He herded animals, sheep, pigs. He was sent to hillsides, remote, exposed, open to the weather from every direction. Ireland in the 5th century was a landscape of forests and bogs and open grassland, and the winter came in from the Atlantic with a cruelty that a boy from Roman Britain had no preparation for. Rain, wind, frost, hail, snow that came sideways and found every gap in the cloth. He was alone. Not metaphorically alone, literally. A teenage boy standing on a hillside in a country whose language he didn't speak, whose customs he didn't understand, whose gods were not his gods, watching animals for a man who owned him, day after day, season after season. For 6 years, Patrick describes what happened to him on that hillside, and the description is one of the most extraordinary passages in early Christian literature. He says he prayed, not occasionally, not when it suited him, 100 times a day and 100 times at night, in the rain, in the snow, in the frost, before dawn and after dark, and during every hour in between. He had arrived in Ireland as a nominal Christian, a boy who went to church because his family went to church, who believed in God the way comfortable people believe in anything they've never needed. On that hillside, with nothing between him and the sky and the cold and the silence, something changed. The faith he'd inherited became something else, something personal, something forged in isolation and suffering and the absolute absence of any other comfort. He didn't find God. God found him. Or more precisely, God was the only thing left. That hillside was not a conversion story. It was a crucible. The boy who went up the hill was a teenager from a comfortable home. The man who came down, 6 years later, hollowed out, hardened, fluent in a language he hadn't known existed, intimate with a landscape that had tried to kill him, was something else entirely. The escape came in a dream. Patrick describes hearing a voice. He doesn't say whether it was God or an angel or simply the voice of his own exhausted mind, telling him that his ship was ready, that it was time to go, that he had to walk. He walked nearly 200 miles, a slave, alone, through territory controlled by chieftains who would have been within their rights to kill him or return him to his master. 200 miles across a country he had only ever seen from the top of a hill, navigating by instinct and by the voice he had heard in his sleep. He reached a port on the southeastern coast. A ship was there. He approached the crew and asked for passage. They refused. He turned away and began to pray. Before he had finished praying, one of the sailors called him back. They would take him. The ship sailed. It landed somewhere. Patrick's description of the journey is confusing and possibly deliberately vague, but most scholars believe he ended up in Gaul, modern-day France. He may have spent time in a monastery. He may have wandered. The chronology of the years between his escape and his return to Britain is uncertain. But he made it home. He was free. He was safe. His family wept. They begged him to stay. They had lost him once. Taken in the night, gone for 6 years, presumed dead or lost forever. And now he was back. The nightmare was over. He never had to think about Ireland again. He could have stayed. He could have taken up his father's position in the local church, married, managed the family estate, lived out a quiet and comfortable life in the only country he had ever been meant to know. He didn't stay because the voice came again, another dream, and this time it wasn't telling him to leave Ireland, it was telling him to go back. In the dream, Patrick describes a man named Victoricus coming to him with letters. When he read the letters, He heard the voices of the Irish people, the people who lived near the Western Sea, near the forest of Fochlute, near the places where he had been enslaved, and they cried out to him with one voice, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us." Holy servant boy, the slave, the boy on the hillside, the people who had taken him were calling him back. Patrick went back to Ireland, not as a slave, not as a conqueror, not with an army or a mandate or a weapon. As a missionary, he returned to the country that had owned him, to the people who had stolen his youth, and he spent the rest of his life among them. That decision, that single, incomprehensible decision to walk back into the place of your own suffering, is the foundation on which the entire story rests. Everything that came after, the conversions, the legends, the snakes, the shamrock, the holiday, the green beer, the global celebration, all of it begins here with a freed slave choosing to return. And what he did when he got there would erase an entire civilization's worth of gods and replace them with his own. Chapter 2. The snakes that never existed. The most famous thing St. Patrick ever did was drive the snakes out of Ireland. It's the story everyone knows. The image on every tea towel and stained glass window. There's just one problem. Ireland has never had snakes. Not one. Not ever. So what did he actually drive out? The legend goes like this. Patrick stood on a hilltop, Croagh Patrick, on the western coast of Ireland, overlooking Clew Bay. He had been fasting for 40 days. He raised his staff, and with the power of God behind him, he drove every serpent from the island of Ireland. The snakes fled before him, sliding down the hillside, pouring into the sea, swimming away from the land, and never returning. From that day forward, Ireland was free of snakes. It's a good story. It's one of the most recognizable legends in all of Christian hagiography. It has been told and retold for over 1,000 years, illustrated in manuscripts, painted on church walls, printed on postcards, and invoked every March 17th by people who know nothing else about the man it describes. And it is, in the most literal sense, impossible. Ireland has never had snakes. Not in Patrick's time, not before Patrick's time, not at any point in the geological history of the island since the retreat of the last glaciers approximately 10,000 years ago. When the Ice Age ended and the glaciers melted, the land bridge that had once connected Ireland to Britain was submerged beneath the rising sea. Snakes, along with moles, weasels, and a number of other species common to mainland Britain, never made it across before the water closed over the crossing. Britain has snakes, 3 species: the adder, the grass snake, and the smooth snake. They colonized Britain via the land bridge before it was severed, but the bridge between Ireland and Britain was submerged earlier, and the snakes never crossed. There have been no native snake species in Ireland for the entirety of recorded human history. Patrick did not drive the snakes from Ireland. There were no snakes to drive. The story is not a miracle. It's a metaphor, and once you understand what the metaphor means, the holiday looks very different. The serpent, in Christian iconography, is one of the oldest and most loaded symbols in the entire tradition. The snake in the Garden of Eden, the creature that tempted Eve, that introduced sin into the world, that served as the instrument of humanity's fall from grace, the dragon defeated by St. George, the serpent crushed under the foot of the Virgin Mary, the beast from the book of Revelation. In every case, the serpent represents the enemy of God, the adversary, the pagan, the other. When the medieval hagiographers, the monks who wrote the lives of the saints, centuries after those saints had lived and died, wrote that Patrick drove the snakes from Ireland, they were not writing natural history, they were writing theology. The snakes were not reptiles, the snakes were pagans. Specifically, the snakes were druids. Before Patrick arrived, Ireland was not a land without religion. It was a land with a religion so deeply rooted in the landscape, so intimately woven into the law and the language and the cycle of the seasons that it was essentially indistinguishable from the culture itself. The Druids were the priesthood of pre-Christian Ireland, but calling them priests understates what they were. They were judges, they were teachers, they were historians, astronomers, healers, and poets. They were the custodians of a vast body of knowledge, legal, scientific, mythological, astronomical, that was transmitted entirely through oral tradition. The Druids did not write. This was not because they couldn't, it was because they chose not to. The knowledge they held was considered too sacred, too powerful, and too dangerous to be committed to writing. It lived in the memory. It was passed from master to student through years of intensive training. Some sources say up to 20 years of memorization, recitation, and examination before a student was considered a fully trained Druid. 20 years. Think about what that means. A young person entering Druidic training would not complete it until they were approaching middle age. The curriculum, if you can call it that, though the word feels inadequate, encompassed law, genealogy, astronomy, medicine, poetry, divination, philosophy, and the vast body of mythological narrative that constituted the Irish understanding of how the universe worked. All of it memorized, all of it carried in the mind, recited, tested, refined, and passed on without a single written character. The Roman writer Julius Caesar, encountering the Druids of Gaul, who were part of the same broader Celtic tradition, wrote that they memorized enormous quantities of verse and that some students spent 20 years in training. He noted that the Druids refused to commit their knowledge to writing, even though they used Greek letters for other purposes. The knowledge was deliberately kept oral. Writing it down, in the Druidic understanding, would have diminished it, would have made it fixed, static, dead on the page. The living voice was the only vessel considered worthy of carrying sacred truth. This system had functioned for centuries, and it had produced something remarkable. The Brecon laws, the legal system of pre-Christian Ireland, were among the most sophisticated in early medieval Europe. They covered property, marriage, inheritance, fosterage, contract, injury, and environmental protection. They established a system of compensation for harm, an elaborate schedule of fines calibrated to the severity of the offense and the status of the victim. That was in many ways more nuanced and more humane than the Roman legal tradition that Patrick carried with him. Women had property rights under Brecon law. They could divorce, they could inherit, they could hold positions of authority. The legal status of women in pre-Christian Ireland was, by several measures, more advanced than their legal status in the Christian Europe that would replace it. The Druids had produced a cosmology, a map of the universe with its own gods, its own creation stories, its own understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead, the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, were the gods of Irish mythology. They were not distant, abstract deities sitting on mountaintops. They lived in the landscape itself. They inhabited the Sheedy, the hollow hills, the ancient burial mounds that dotted the Irish countryside. Every hill, every river, every lake, every forest had a story attached to it, a name, a presence. The land was not just land, it was a text, a sacred document written in soil and stone that the Druids could read and the people could feel, and they had produced a calendar, aligned to the solstices and equinoxes and the movements of the stars, with 4 great festivals marking the turning of the year. Samhain, on the 1st of November, marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of the dark half of the year. It was the night when the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was at its thinnest, when the spirits of the ancestors could walk among the living, when the Sheedy opened and the Tuatha De Danann moved freely through the mortal world. Bonfires were lit on hilltops, offerings were made, the dead were honored. It was solemn, communal, and deeply embedded in the agricultural cycle that governed every aspect of Irish life. You know it today as Halloween. The costumes, the bonfires, the association with death and the supernatural. All of it traces back to Samhain, the Druids' festival, wearing a Christian costume. Imbolc, on the 1st of February, marked the beginning of spring. It was associated with the goddess Brigid, a deity of fire, of poetry, of healing, and of smithcraft. When Christianity arrived, Brigid was not destroyed. She was canonized. She became Saint Brigid, one of the 3 patron saints of Ireland alongside Patrick himself. Her feast day fell on the 1st of February. Her holy wells were rededicated. Her fire was relit as a Christian flame. The goddess became a saint. The worshippers barely noticed the difference. Beltane, on the 1st of May, marked the beginning of summer. Lugnasad, on the 1st of August, marked the beginning of the harvest season. Each festival had its own rituals, its own stories, its own relationship to the land and the light and the turning of the year. This was what Patrick walked into, not a spiritual vacuum, not a primitive darkness waiting for the light of Christianity to fill it. A fully functioning civilization with its own priesthood, its own law, its own cosmology, its own calendar, its own relationship to the sacred, and its own understanding of the land that was older than anything Patrick's religion could offer. And Patrick replaced it. He didn't do it with violence. That matters, and it should be said clearly. Patrick did not arrive with soldiers. He did not burn temples or massacre druids or wage a campaign of extermination. He was more sophisticated than that, and perhaps more compassionate, or perhaps simply more strategic. He worked through the power structure. He went to the chieftains first. He negotiated. He learned Irish language. He was already fluent from his years of slavery, an advantage no other Roman British missionary could have claimed. He understood the culture from the inside, not as a foreigner looking in, but as a man who had lived inside it, worked inside it, suffered inside it, and he adapted. He didn't demand that the Irish abandon their entire cultural framework. He fitted Christianity over it like a new garment over an old body. He took the sacred sites, the holy wells, the hilltops, the gathering places, and rededicated them to Christian saints. The well where the Druids had performed their rites became the holy well of Saint Brigid or Saint Comsil. The hilltop where the old gods had been invoked became the site of a church. The festivals were absorbed into the Christian calendar with such precision that the seams are still visible 1500 years later. Samhain became All Saints' Day. Imbolc became St. Brigid's Day. The old festivals survived, but the gods they honoured were gone. The shamrock. Patrick is said to have used the 3-leafed clover, the seamrog, growing wild in every field in Ireland, to explain the doctrine of the Holy Trinity. 3 leaves, 1 stem, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. 3 persons, 1 God. Whether he actually did this is unknown. The shamrock story doesn't appear in Patrick's own writings. It first appears in texts written centuries after his death, but the symbolism is clear. He took something that grew from Irish soil and used it to teach a foreign theology. He used the land to replace the religion of the land. Because the Druids didn't write. When the last Druid died, the knowledge died with them. The oral tradition that had sustained an entire civilization's understanding of itself, its laws, its cosmology, its history, its relationship to the divine, was not recorded by the people who held it. It was recorded selectively and partially by the people who replaced it. The Christian monks who followed in Patrick's wake wrote down some of the old Irish myths, the stories of Cuchulainn and Fionn mac Cumhail, the mythological cycles, but they wrote them as literature, not as scripture. The sacred dimension was stripped away. The gods became characters. The religion became folklore. We know almost nothing about what the Druids actually believed, in their own words, from their own perspective, because the Druids' own words were never written down. The only record of pre-Christian Irish religion comes from the pens of the people who dismantled it. The victors wrote the history, the vanquished left only silence. The snakes were driven out, and they took their stories with them. Patrick is credited with bringing literacy to Ireland. The Latin alphabet, the written word, the technology of the book, the monastic tradition he helped establish would produce some of the greatest manuscript art in history. The Book of Kells, the Book of Durrow, illuminated gospels of staggering beauty. Irish monks would preserve classical learning through the darkest centuries of the early Middle Ages, copying and recopying Latin texts while the rest of Europe burned. But the technology that preserved one tradition was the same technology that rendered the other obsolete. Writing replaced memory, the book replaced the druid, and the stories that were never written down became the snakes, driven from the island, swallowed by the sea, gone. That is the real legend of St. Patrick and the snakes, not a miracle, a metaphor for one of the most complete cultural replacements in European history, and the holiday we celebrate in his name, the green beer, the parades, the shamrocks pinned to lapels, is a celebration of the man who made it happen. But here's what should truly surprise you. The holiday we know, the party, the spectacle, the global event, was never celebrated in Ireland, not the way you know it, because for most of the 20th century, the country that the rest of the world associated with drinking on St. Patrick's Day had closed every pub in the country, by law. Chapter 3. The day Ireland closed the pubs. For 34 years, while the rest of the world was raising a glass to the patron saint of Ireland, Ireland itself had locked the doors. March 17th was a religious holiday, and the pubs were shut, by law. If you wanted a drink on St. Patrick's Day in Ireland, you had to go to a dog show. St. Patrick's Day, March the 17th, is believed to be the date of Patrick's death, sometime around the year 461 AD. The day has been observed as a Christian feast day since the early 17th century. For centuries in Ireland, that's exactly what it was. A feast day, a holy day. You went to Mass in the morning, you had a family dinner. If your town had a modest parade, a few floats, a marching band, some children waving flags, you watched it from the footpath in your Sunday clothes. It was quiet, it was pious, it was not a party. This was a country that, until very recently in historical terms, was one of the most devoutly Catholic societies in the Western world. The church was not just a spiritual institution in Ireland. It ran the schools, it ran the hospitals, it shaped the law, it determined what could be said in public, what could be published, what could be shown in cinemas, how families were structured, and how children were raised. When the church said March 17th was a holy day, Ireland treated it as a holy day, and holy days were dry days. In 1927, the Irish government passed the Intoxicating Liquor Act. Among its provisions was a requirement that all public houses close on certain religious holidays. Christmas Day, Good Friday, and St. Patrick's Day. The law was explicit. No pub could open its doors on March 17th. No alcohol could be sold. The patron saint's day was to be observed with prayer and reflection, not with drinking. This lasted for 34 years. From 1927 to 1961, every pub in Ireland was closed on St. Patrick's Day. The only exception, and this is the detail that sounds like fiction but is completely, verifiably true, was the annual dog show organised by the Royal Dublin Society. The RDS show, held every March at their grounds in Ballsbridge, had a special licence to serve alcohol. It was, for decades, the only place in Ireland where you could legally buy a drink on March 17th. The result was predictable. The RDS dog show on St. Patrick's Day became one of the best attended events in the Dublin social calendar. Not because of an overwhelming national passion for canine breeding, because it had a bar. Irish people who wanted a pint on their own patron saint's day had to stand in an exhibition hall surrounded by terriers and spaniels, pretending to be interested in breed standards just to hold a glass. The absurdity of it became a running joke. A joke that lasted for 3 decades because the law lasted for 3 decades. In 1961, the restriction was finally lifted. Pubs were allowed to open on St. Patrick's Day, but the parades remained modest. The celebrations remained local. The global spectacle that March 17th has become. The one with the green rivers and the green landmarks and the green everything. That wasn't built in Ireland. It was built 3,000 miles away by people who had been told they were the lowest form of life in the New World. Chapter 4. The people they called animals. The St. Patrick's Day, you know. The parades, the drinking, the green, was built by immigrants. Not just any immigrants. The most despised, most dehumanized, most violently excluded immigrant community in 19th century America. The celebration wasn't joy. It was a fist raised in a country that told them to disappear. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland died. The Great Famine, An Gorta Mór in Irish, killed approximately 1 million people and forced another million to emigrate within the span of 7 years. The population of Ireland, which had been over 8 million in 1841, fell to 6.5 million by 1851. It would continue to fall for decades. Ireland would not reach its pre-famine population level again in the 20th century. It has not reached it yet. The cause was a blight, Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that destroyed the potato crop on which 1/3 of the Irish population depended for their primary source of nutrition. The potato was not a luxury in Ireland. It was survival. Entire families, tenant farmers working land they didn't own, paying rent to landlords who often lived in England, subsisted on potatoes and little else. When the blight struck, there was no alternative. There was no safety net. There was starvation. The British government's response was, by most historical assessments, catastrophically inadequate. Relief programs were implemented, then scaled back, then restructured around the principle that the Irish poor should not become dependent on government aid. Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official overseeing famine relief, wrote that the famine was the judgment of God on an indolent and unself-reliant people, and that the crisis must not be too much mitigated. Food was exported from Ireland during the famine: grain, livestock, dairy, because the market demanded it and the law permitted it. Ships carrying Irish wheat and oats sailed out of ports like Cork and Dublin, while the people in the streets outside those ports were dying. The economic system continued to function while the people inside it starved. Evictions accelerated the catastrophe. Landlords, many of them absentee, living in England, managing their Irish estates through agents, evicted tenants who could no longer pay rent, not quietly, not with paperwork and legal notice, with crowbars and soldiers. The tumbling of Irish cottages became a common practice during the famine years. Once a family was removed, the walls of their home were knocked down to prevent them from returning. Families that had lived on the same land for generations found themselves standing in a field, watching their home collapse, with nowhere to go and nothing to eat. The result was a wave of emigration so massive that it reshaped the demography of the English-speaking world. But calling it emigration makes it sound like a choice. For most of the people who left Ireland during the famine, the alternative to leaving was death. They crossed the Atlantic on what came to be called coffin ships. The name was not metaphorical. The vessels that carried Irish emigrants to North America during the famine were, in many cases, cargo ships hastily converted to carry human passengers. They were overcrowded, they were unsanitary, they were not designed for the weeks-long Atlantic crossing. Passengers were packed into steerage, the lowest deck below the waterline, in conditions that would have been illegal for the transport of cattle. They slept on wooden platforms with no bedding. They shared a single bucket for a toilet. The ventilation was almost non-existent. Disease spread through the hold like fire through paper. Typhus, cholera, dysentery. Passengers, already weakened by months or years of malnutrition, had no resistance. People died in their bunks. People died on the deck. People died in sight of land and were buried at sea. Their bodies slipped over the rail into the Atlantic, sometimes with a prayer, sometimes without. On some crossings, the mortality rate exceeded 30%. One ship in 3 became a floating graveyard. The survivors who made it to North America did not always find safety on the other side. Grosse Île, a small island in the St. Lawrence River, 30 miles downstream from Quebec City, served as a quarantine station for ships arriving from Ireland. In the summer of 1847, the worst year of the famine, the ships arrived faster than the island could process them. Dozens of vessels were anchored in the river, waiting to dock, their passengers sick and dying in the holds. The medical facilities on the island were overwhelmed. The healthy were quarantined alongside the dying. Corpses were buried in mass graves. Over 5,000 people died on Grosse Île in 1847, alone. Many of them were children. A memorial on the island today carries an inscription in Irish, English, and French, and the names, when the names are known, of the dead. These were the people who built St. Patrick's Day, not revelers, survivors, people who had crossed an ocean in a coffin ship, buried their family members at sea or in the mass graves of a quarantine island, and walked off the dock into a country that looked at them and saw something less than human. And America did not welcome them. No Irish need apply. Those 4 words, abbreviated NINA, appeared in shop windows, factory gates, and classified advertisements across the northeastern United States. They were not hidden. They were not whispered. They were printed in black letters on white card and displayed in public because excluding the Irish from employment was considered not just acceptable, but sensible. The comparisons were explicit. The Irish were called white Negroes, a phrase that appeared in print repeatedly in respectable publications without irony or embarrassment. The London-based magazine Punch, one of the most widely read periodicals in the English-speaking world, published cartoons depicting the Irish as creatures with jutting jaws and sloping skulls, positioned on an evolutionary chart somewhere between the Negro and the Anglo-Teutonic. The pseudoscience of the day provided a framework that made the dehumanization feel rational. It wasn't prejudice, it was biology. The Irish were simply a lesser breed. Science said so. The visual propaganda reinforced this at industrial scale. Thomas Nast, Harper's Weekly star illustrator and one of the most influential political cartoonists in American history, drew the Irish as subhuman. His cartoons depicted Irish men with sloping foreheads, heavy brows, and bestial expressions. The visual vocabulary of racial science applied to a European ethnic group. The Irish were drawn as apes, as brutes, as creatures occupying a space between the human and the animal, incapable of self-governance, genetically predisposed to violence and drink and idleness. This imagery was not confined to a single publication. It was mainstream. It appeared in newspapers, magazines, political pamphlets, and popular entertainment across the United States and Britain. The Know Nothing movement of the 1850s, a political party built explicitly on anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiment, won elections across the northeastern states. They campaigned on the promise of restricting Irish immigration and preventing Catholics from holding public office. At their peak, they controlled the governorships of several states and held over 100 seats in the United States Congress. Anti-Irish hatred was not a fringe position. It was a platform. It won votes. The housing reflected the hierarchy. Irish immigrants were concentrated in the worst districts of the worst cities. Basements, tenements, buildings so overcrowded that multiple families shared single rooms. In Boston, the Irish packed into the North End and Fort Hill. In New York, the 5 Points, a neighborhood so notorious for its squalor and violence that it became a byword for urban degradation across the English-speaking world. The mortality rates in Irish immigrant neighborhoods rivaled those of the famine itself. Cholera, tuberculosis, and typhus moved through the tenements with the efficiency of a system designed to produce death, which in a sense it was. The housing wasn't an accident, it was an economy. Landlords crammed as many bodies into as few rooms as possible because the bodies kept coming and the bodies had nowhere else to go. The work was the work no one else would do. The canals, the railroads, the mines, the docks. Irish labourers built the Erie Canal, 363 miles of waterway carved through the bedrock of upstate New York, connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic and transforming the economy of the entire continent. They dug it with shovels and pickaxes. They stood in water up to their waists. They contracted malaria from the swamps, cholera from the contaminated water. They drank because no one provided clean water to the men doing the digging. In some camps along the canal route, the death rate was so high that construction supervisors simply hired replacements for the dead and kept moving forward. The canal was completed in 1825. The men who built it were not mentioned in the speeches at the opening ceremony. Irish labourers laid the tracks of the Transcontinental Railroad, not the celebrated Golden Spike at Promontory Summit, but the thousands of miles of track before it, laid through mountains and deserts and winters that killed men by the score. The Central Pacific used Chinese labour from the west. The Union Pacific used Irish labour from the east. Both groups were worked to exhaustion, paid poorly, housed in temporary camps that offered no protection from the weather or from disease, and remembered, if they were remembered at all, as a category rather than as individuals. The Irish built the railroad, not Patrick O'Brien from County Cork, who left a wife and 3 children in a tenement in Boston and never came home, not Michael Flanagan from Galway, who died in a blasting accident in the Rockies and was buried in an unmarked grave by men who didn't know his last name. The Irish, a labour force, a resource, a line in a budget. They died in the work. They died of cholera in the canal camps. They died in mining collapses. They died in construction accidents that were reported in the papers with the same emotional weight as a broken piece of machinery. Because that is what they were, in the eyes of the people who employed them. Expendable, replaceable, Irish. And out of this, out of the starvation and the slurs and the Nina signs and the ape cartoons and the basement tenements and the canal graves, they built something. They built community, mutual aid societies, organizations where Irish immigrants pooled their money to support members who fell sick or lost work or died and left families behind, Catholic parishes that served as the social, spiritual and political center of Irish neighborhoods, political machines, Tammany Hall in New York, the ward bosses of Boston and Chicago, that converted the community's numbers into votes and its votes into leverage. The Irish couldn't get hired through the front door of American society, so they built their own door. And they built St. Patrick's Day, the earliest recorded St. Patrick's Day parade in what would become the United States, took place in 1762, not in Ireland, in New York City. Irish soldiers serving in the British Army marched through the streets of Lower Manhattan to a tavern where they celebrated their patron saint with music, food, and drink. By the 19th century, the parades had grown massively in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in every city with a significant Irish population. The St. Patrick's Day Parade became an annual event of escalating scale and ambition. Bands marched, banners flew, organizations competed for position in the procession. Politicians walked the route, shaking hands, demonstrating their allegiance to the Irish vote. The parades were not celebrations of a 5th century saint. They were demonstrations, political demonstrations, cultural demonstrations, existential demonstrations. The message was not subtle. It was shouted from floats and printed on banners and embodied in the physical fact of thousands of Irish men and women marching through the streets of a city that had told them they were subhuman. We are here. We are many. We are not going away. The green, Patrick's original colour was not green, it was blue, St. Patrick's blue, a pale sky blue shade that had been associated with the saint for centuries and that still appears on the presidential standard of Ireland. Green became the colour of Ireland through the independence movement, the green of the shamrock, the green of the Irish flag, the green of the Society of United Irishmen and the rebellion of 1798. It was a political colour before it was a holiday colour. When Irish Americans draped themselves in green on March 17th, they were not continuing a religious tradition, they were making a political statement, the drinking. The association between St. Patrick's Day and alcohol was an American construction, and its origins are more complicated than the drunken Irish stereotype suggests. The pub, or its American equivalent, the saloon, was the centre of Irish American community life. It was the place where news was shared, where jobs were found, where political allegiances were formed, where music was played, where the language and the culture and the identity of a displaced people were kept alive in a hostile country. Going to the pub on St. Patrick's Day wasn't about getting drunk. It was about gathering. It was about visibility. It was about taking up space in a country that had told you to disappear. Over the decades, the holiday grew. The Irish American community gained power. Political power, economic power, cultural power. The Niner signs came down. The ape cartoons faded from the newspapers. The Irish became, gradually, and then rapidly, part of the American establishment. John F. Kennedy, the great-grandson of famine immigrants, was elected president in 1960. The outsiders were inside, and St. Patrick's Day went with them. It expanded beyond the Irish community and became, by the late 20th century, something that belonged to everyone. Everyone's Irish on St. Patrick's Day. A holiday built by the excluded was adopted by the culture that had excluded them. The fist unclenched and became an open hand. Whether that transformation is a triumph or a loss depends on where you stand. The holiday that began as a defiant assertion of identity, a refusal to be invisible, a demand to be seen, became a party, a universal, commercial, political party where the history has been replaced by green beer and novelty hats and a feeling of vague, warm, unspecified Irishness that has about as much connection to the actual Irish experience as a leprechaun has to a famine ship. But the foundation is still there, underneath the green, underneath the beer, underneath the Kiss Me I'm Irish buttons and the plastic shamrocks and the river dyed green in a city built by Irish labourers who were considered less than human. The foundation is 1 million dead, 1 million more exiled, and the survivors building a celebration so loud that the country that tried to silence them had no choice but to listen. That's what you're toasting on March 17th, whether you know it or not. Chapter 5. The Brand. The holiday was built by the despised. It became a global celebration. But the final twist is the strangest of all, because the version of St. Patrick's Day the world now celebrates was engineered, deliberately, with a budget, a strategy, and a specific return on investment by the Irish government. In the 1990s, by the middle of the 20th century, a peculiar inversion had taken place. St. Patrick's Day was one of the most visible cultural celebrations on Earth. In New York, in Boston, in Chicago, in Sydney, in London, in every city with a significant Irish diaspora. The parades were enormous. The participation was massive. The day had become a global marker of Irish identity. But in Ireland itself, March 17th was still a quiet affair. The pubs had reopened in 1961. Local parades had resumed. But there was nothing in Dublin or Cork or Galway that could compete with the spectacle of Fifth Avenue in New York, where the parade had been running continuously since the 18th century and attracted over 2 million spectators every year. The country whose patron saint the world was celebrating had the least impressive celebration of all. In the 1990s, Ireland changed. the Celtic Tiger economy, a period of explosive economic growth fueled by foreign investment, low corporate taxes, and European Union funding, transformed the country from one of the poorest in Western Europe to one of the wealthiest. GDP growth hit double digits, unemployment plummeted, multinational corporations, Intel, Dell, Microsoft, Pfizer, established European headquarters in Ireland. The country that had exported its people for a century and a half was suddenly importing workers. With the economic transformation came a cultural one. Ireland was rebranding itself, not as the land of saints and scholars, not as the country of the famine and the emigrant ship, but as a modern, open, globally connected economy, a country that could compete. And the government looked at St. Patrick's Day and saw something that no amount of advertising could buy: a pre-existing global platform. One day a year, in every major city on earth, people thought about Ireland. They wore Irish colours, they drank Irish products, they felt, however vaguely, a connection to Ireland. That was the most valuable piece of cultural real estate any small country had ever possessed. In 1996, the Irish government established the St. Patrick's Festival, not a parish parade, a festival, multi-day, professionally produced, publicly funded, held in Dublin, designed to rival the great celebrations of New York and transform March 17th from a modest domestic observance into a world-class tourism event that would draw visitors to Ireland rather than sending Irish culture out. The festival grew. Year by year, the budget increased, the programming expanded, the parade through Dublin became a spectacle, choreographed, theatrical, broadcast live on television, and streamed around the world. By the 2000s, the St. Patrick's Festival was attracting over 500,000 visitors to Dublin every March. But the government didn't stop at Dublin. In 2010, Tourism Ireland, the state body responsible for marketing the island of Ireland to international tourists, launched an initiative that would take the holiday from a celebration to a global phenomenon. They called it the global greening. The concept was simple and audacious. Contact the operators of the world's most famous landmarks. Ask them to light their buildings, their monuments, their structures in green on St. Patrick's Day. Coordinate the campaign globally. Document everything with photography and video. Distribute the images worldwide. The Sydney Opera House went green. The Empire State Building went green. The London Eye went green. The Colosseum in Rome. The Leaning Tower of Pisa. Christ the Redeemer in Rio de Janeiro. The Pyramids of Giza. Niagara Falls. The Great Wall of China. The Burj Al Arab in Dubai. Hundreds of landmarks in dozens of countries, all turning green on March 17. Every single one of these was the result of a negotiation, a tourism board official contacting a landmark operator, a proposal being sent, a schedule being coordinated, a lighting arrangement being specified. This was not spontaneous. This was not the world falling in love with Ireland unprompted. This was a marketing campaign, executed with the precision of a military operation, funded by the Irish taxpayer, designed to generate media coverage that would keep Ireland visible in the global tourism market. And it worked. The global greening generates millions of dollars in equivalent advertising value every year. The images of the pyramids glowing green, of the Colosseum bathed in emerald light, travel across social media and news outlets and front pages. And every image carries the same implicit message: Ireland is everywhere. Ireland is welcome everywhere. Ireland belongs on the same stage as the pyramids and the Colosseum and the Sydney Opera House. The country that closed its pubs on St. Patrick's Day now runs the world's most recognizable one-day marketing campaign. The holiday that was built by starving immigrants in 19th century tenements has been reverse engineered by a 21st century government and sold back to the world as a brand. Step back and look at the layers. A Roman British teenager kidnapped and enslaved in the 5th century, a missionary who returned to the land of his captivity and replaced its gods, a religious feast day that closed every pub in the country for 34 years, an immigrant community that built a celebration out of defiance and survival in a country that called them animals, and a government tourism board that took all of it, the pain, the pride, the history, the resilience, and packaged it into a global brand with a color palette and a media strategy, each layer painted over the last. The slave became a saint, the saint became a feast day, the feast day became a party, the party became a brand, and the brand became so successful that most people on earth have never seen past the first coat of paint. The green isn't tradition. Patrick's color was blue. The shamrock wasn't a symbol of Ireland, it was a teaching tool for a foreign religion. The snakes were never snakes, the drinking was American. The parades were political, the global greening is a marketing campaign. And the man at the center of it all, the boy on the hillside, the slave in the rain, the freedman who chose to go back, has been buried so deep beneath the merchandise that most people couldn't tell you a single true thing about him. He deserves better than green beer.
That St. Patrick's Day, a teenage boy kidnapped from Britain and enslaved on the Irish hillside for 6 years, a freed slave who walked 200 miles to escape and then chose to go back, a missionary who drove out the snakes, not serpents, but an entire civilization of gods and druids and oral traditions that were never written down and can never be recovered, a holy day that closed every pub in Ireland for 34 years, a celebration built by immigrants who were drawn as apes in the newspapers of a country they were building with their bare hands, and a brand engineered in the 1990s by a government tourism board that now turns the pyramids green once a year. Next time you raise a glass on March 17th, you know what you're holding. Not just a pint, a history of slavery and conversion and famine and exclusion and survival and reinvention and finally marketing. The man behind all of it spent 6 years alone in the rain, praying 100 times a day, owned by people he would later convert. That's not a party, that's one of the most extraordinary human stories ever lived. And we buried it under green beer. If this changed the way you see St. Patrick's Day, subscribe to the Midnight Archives, where we illuminate the dark corners of history, the stories that live beneath the ones we tell ourselves. Until next time, keep the candle lit.